3. Lord Knock of Knock shall now award the prize.
Now, it is always sad to have to pick out a winner when all have behaved with such consummate absurdity. But let the losers take comfort in the thought that they will never, ever look so foolish again. But a victor there must be, and myself and Lady Knock are proud to present this glorious trophy to the proud winner, here on behalf of the Save the Children Fund, Her Royal Highness, the Princess Royal. May she, thank you, may she carry it back with pride to her faithful troops, and let them never forget the day they came to Alton dressed up as headless men and giant vegetables, and won a mighty victory. Your Royal Highness, many congratulations, and farewell to you all.
Hello, what do you think this is? It looks a bit disgusting, but it's sausage meat, and it's being made into a 7-mile-long sausage. Of course, at the moment it's being loaded into crates, but it will be fried in Hyde Park tomorrow as part of the St. John Ambulance centenary celebrations. I'll be in Hyde Park with Sarah Kennedy and thousands of St. John Ambulance volunteers, and their guest of honour is Her Majesty the Queen. So join us live for the party in the park at 10:40 tomorrow on BBC1. You think the sausage is big? You should see the size of the egg.
In a moment, BBC2 completes the final chapter in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is BBC1.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Martin Lewis and Andrew Harvey.
South Korea's government warns the rioters, stop the violence or face martial law.
15 shoppers die as a car bomb explodes in a Barcelona supermarket.
A gunman kills himself after a police station siege in Gloucester.
The Bahamas Prime Minister faces the voters with drug smuggling the key election issue.
And his last adventure, Richard Branson heads up and away for the great balloon race across the Atlantic. Good evening. South Korea is on the verge of martial law tonight after the government warned it would take extraordinary steps to curb the growing student violence. The threat to send in the troops came just hours after demonstrators killed a policeman, the first death in 10 days of rioting. The students, whose support is growing, are demanding democratic elections. President Chun Doo-hwan says for that they'll have to wait until after South Korea stages next year's Olympic Games. But the protesters say they want democracy first, Olympics later. The president insists the Olympics will go ahead as planned, but the United States today joined the Soviet Union in insisting that their athletes won't go if they might be at risk. And already Los Angeles and Berlin have offered to take over the Games.
Today, some 40,000 South Korean students again joined protest rallies, some of which ended in violence. Their annual exams have been postponed, and most campuses are officially closed. But the students say they'll carry on the struggle throughout the summer. Hundreds of university teachers support the students' demands, and they're summed up in the slogan heard at every rally, Dukche Tado, down with dictatorship. The students see themselves as the conscience of the nation, and they say their struggle cannot end until the present government is swept away. After the latest show of South Korean people power, top officials of President Chun's ruling party met to discuss the sort of concessions which could take the sting out of the protests. But President Chun has all but vetoed that approach. He will not meet the official opposition or reopen the key issue of constitutional change. Instead, his Prime Minister made a general appeal to the people to go back to business as usual, or else the Chun government would take more powers, meaning martial law. That line of action, his top advisors say, would spell disaster for the Seoul Olympic Games next year. Mr. Chun has asked his people to toe the line until after the Olympics. But the students and many others say, give us democracy first and the Olympics later. This is William Horsley for the 9 o'clock news in Seoul.
The riots and the government's reaction to them are being watched anxiously by the Americans. President Reagan is reported to have written a private letter to President Chun, urging him not to overreact and to open talks with the reformers. Already parallels are being drawn with the Philippines, where people power eventually destroyed a regime. Our diplomatic editor John Simpson looks at how far that experience applies in South Korea.
It may look at times like a rerun of last year's revolution against President Marcos in the Philippines, but there's little resemblance, apart from the fact that most of the demonstrators are middle class. It isn't people power on the streets of Seoul, it's police power. The regime isn't going to crumble, and it has the full backing of the military. It remains essentially a military dictatorship, even though it has the trappings of a political party, and the leaders wear suits rather than uniforms. The country those leaders govern has undergone one of the world's great economic miracles. It's taken hard work. Some firms still allow only 3 days holiday a year. But people have a standard of living comparable with some common market countries, when only 25 years ago it was a poor peasant economy. Its industrial production has increased by 5,000% in that time. Exports have increased by 10,000%, and the average income doubles every 8 years. The trouble is, it's a country born in division and violence. Every single government has been brought down by rioting or military intervention. The growing wealth has simply generated larger numbers of university students. There are proportionately more of them than in Britain, and therefore there are more recruits to the massive protest movements. And the state continues to repress even moderate political opposition with ferocity. Torture remains in common use. And when the regime is in trouble, it's only got martial law to turn to, which is what President Chun seems to be planning now.
Clearly, within South Korean society, one has a sophisticated population now who are demanding meaningful democratic change. My guess would be that President Chun's successor designate, like Chun, a general also, Mr. Roh Tae-woo, would then have the option of liberalizing when he comes to power next February. And from what we know of Mr. Roh Tae-woo, he does seem to be a rather more moderate figure than President Chun himself.
But there's a deadline now, the Olympic Games in September next year. A huge amount of cash and prestige is being invested in the Seoul Olympics, but as happens in other countries, the Games may simply increase the instability, and there's no shortage of that already.
A car bomb explosion in Barcelona has killed at least 15 people and injured 30 more. It's one of Spain's worst terrorist attacks. The bomb exploded in the underground car park of a crowded supermarket, causing widespread panic amongst shoppers.
The car park, which shares the same floor as a food market, was busy with shoppers after a Spanish bank holiday. When the bomb exploded, there was great panic, and the flames and smoke hampered the rescue teams. Among those who died were 2 children and a pregnant woman. Many others are in hospital with severe burns. There was little warning. Somebody claiming to represent the Basque terrorist group ETA telephoned a local newspaper 5 minutes before the bomb went off, leaving little or no time to clear the shopping centre. It's the worst ever attack by ETA, and the fact that it was a wholly civilian target will greatly worry the Spanish authorities. ETA has switched its attention to Barcelona ever since its group in Madrid was arrested and broken up by the police. This is Joe Paley for the 9 o'clock news in Spain.
A man armed with a pistol and a shotgun killed himself after holding a policeman hostage in Gloucester police station for almost 9 hours. Paul Anthony Eyre refused pleas from police negotiators to give himself up after his hostage had escaped unharmed. PC Bill Matthews had been investigating reports of a burglary when Paul Eyre produced a gun and forced the constable to drive 15 miles from the Cotswold village of Withington into the centre of Gloucester.
Talking frequently over the police car's radio to Gloucester Police Headquarters, the gunman had ordered his hostage to drive him to his former girlfriend's house in Gloucester, and then when he found the police had got there first and taken her into protective custody, on to the police headquarters. There he held the policeman in a ground floor room for 5 hours, talking through an open door to a negotiator, while a squad of armed policemen was deployed outside the building. In the middle of the morning, Constable Matthews managed to slip away, snapped by a waiting press photographer as he hurried with a colleague from the building, wearing his uniform trousers and pullover, his shirt collar unbuttoned. Not long afterwards, the waiting policeman heard 3 shots, and as an ambulance moved closer, the gunman was found dead inside the deserted police station. Gloucestershire's Assistant Chief Constable, Mr. Hubert Reynolds, said that 5 people, including members of the man's family, had been picked up and taken away from their homes for their own safety before the hijacked police car reached Gloucester, and that Constable Matthews, who'd been sent home immediately afterwards, had been calm and courageous throughout. He'd been in very great danger.
200 hippies hoping to celebrate Midsummer Night at Stonehenge on Sunday have been broken up into small groups and moved on again. The police used the new Public Order Act to make them leave their latest camp. That was at Collingbourne Wood, 15 miles from Stonehenge. The hippies left peacefully, but most of them have now reassembled at Devil's Ditch, which is even closer to the monument. Only 500 people with tickets will be allowed at Stonehenge for the solstice. The new act says the police can disperse an assembly of more than 20 people if they're gathered in the open air for a common purpose and if the gathering could be disruptive. The new law was passed to prevent a repeat of last summer's trouble when the so-called peace convoy trespassed on farmland and the law proved inadequate. There were then violent clashes between hippies and the police.
This is the reality behind the hippie dream of a free festival at Stonehenge. Cold, wet and probably hopeless, but they can't afford to let it get them down. Inside last night's camp, churning wheels had left a sea of mud. This was the main path between the tents. The police had held off. They could have moved the hippies on under the new Public Order Act any time in the last few days. They had the means to do it, but they waited until this morning. There were 250 illegal campers. The notice said any still there this afternoon would be liable to arrest. The police meant it, and the hippies knew they did. Slowly and unwillingly, they packed up their benders and their belongings, ready to set off again. Where are you going to go?
Dunno.
What about Stonehenge? Is that still a possibility?
Oh, we're going to go for it, yeah, I'm going for it. Definitely.
Many of them said that, but very few believed it. There was bitterness, resentment, even fear, but no resistance and no arrests. When they set off, most of them didn't even know where they were heading for. And wherever they did go, the police were watching. If they tried to leave the road, they were tracked down and directed back to it. If they tried to walk down it, it was only to be in small groups.
Next three can move on then.
They travel 3 at a time, limping down the gutter through the rain. Tonight, 5 miles down the road, they're setting up another camp. It's on private land, though, and they're not likely to be allowed to stay there any length of time. And when they do leave, say the police, it won't be for a Stonehenge festival.
The people of the Bahamas are deciding now whether to end the 20-year rule of Sir Lyndon Pindling and his Progressive Liberal Party. Sir Lyndon is seeking his 6th successive term as Prime Minister. He headed the country's first black majority government in the late 60s and in 1973 led the Bahamas to independence from Britain. But in recent years, the Bahamas have become a safe transit point for drugs coming out of South America. 40% of the cocaine and much of the marijuana that ends up in the United States is smuggled through the hundreds of islands that make up the Bahamas. In 1984, a royal commission found evidence of top-level corruption and involvement in drug smuggling. 6 members of Sir Lyndon's government were sacked or resigned, but Sir Lyndon himself wasn't directly implicated. Now the United States says he still isn't doing enough to combat the smugglers, and the opposition has made drugs and corruption the main issues of the election campaign.
Steady as she goes, the ruling PLP party's slogan. More appropriate would be "Don't rock the boat," for Sir Lyndon Pindling has been in power for 20 years, and he's intent on hanging on to it. But it is a little ironic that he should be campaigning with the symbol of a ship, for while the closing rallies have been held this week, the boats which have tarnished his reputation have been slipping out of the Bahamas more frequently than ever, en route for the Florida coastline. The operation to prevent drug trafficking is more intense than ever, and the smugglers are getting more inventive. The Americans not only patrol their own coastline, they have agreements with the Bahamians to operate in the islands themselves, an arrangement that Washington is determined to keep. For the marijuana and cocaine is now coming in by the ton.
We're missing a lot of it as it comes in. We try, but they can be smuggled into such small packages and hidden in so many small places until, unless we actually get down and tear a boat all to pieces, you know, we'll miss it sometimes. And then sometimes we just get lucky. Intelligence will let us know, and we'll know exactly where to look when the boat comes in.
A ton of cocaine, street value about £10 million, seized a few days ago and not the week's biggest haul. The drug enforcement authorities say the Colombian drug barons show no sign of giving up the Bahamas as their transshipment base. 700 islands close to the American mainland. They're just too attractive. And drugs have dominated the election. Everyone who has a vote knows personally what goes on here. Drugs dealt openly, an economy awash with illegal money, and an unemployment problem which stems partly from the fact that a year's wages can be earned in one night's work for the smugglers. Kendall Isaacs leads the opposition Free National Movement Party, an opposition which has gathered momentum in the past few months. It's particularly incensed that former government ministers who were fired or resigned because of corruption have reappeared in Pindling's campaign. They're also worried that re-election for Pindling spells trouble with the Americans, who are now showing exasperation with what they see as tolerance of trafficking. And there's probably vote rigging. It's no secret that the electoral roll is incomplete and muddled. Everything points to the result being a very close-run thing. But whoever wins, the whole campaign has served to emphasize that the two main problems of drugs and corruption will not go away. This is Kate Adey for the 9 o'clock news in the Bahamas.
Fighting has broken out between rival factions in Beirut tonight. Police have reported rocket and machine gun fire in the southern suburbs of the city, the area where most Western hostages are believed to be held. The latest hostage, American journalist Charles Glass, was seized as he drove through the city on Wednesday. Today in London, his wife said she believed the Syrians were trying to secure his release.
We've had some reports from friends and contacts in Syria and Lebanon today that a lot of negotiation has been going on with the Syrians.
At what level are the Syrians involved? Up to what level?
I gather that President Assad himself is taking an interest in the case.
You do?
That's what I hear from Damascus.
Do you know what action he has asked to be taken?
No, I don't.